Protecting Uyghurs in China, the U.S. House of Representatives passes a proposed law demanding the closure of so-called re-education camps for around 1 million Muslims. Beijing warns Congress and Trump not to endorse what it calls a smear campaign. Can U.S. legislation change anything for China's imprisoned Muslim minority? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahlbara. US politicians are sending one of their strongest ever warnings to China over the crackdown on Uyghur people. More than 1 million of the Muslim ethnic minority have been imprisoned in what leaders describe as vocational training camps. The government says inmates are there voluntarily to renounce so-called extremist thoughts. But rights groups label the re-education camps in Xinjiang province in western China as prisons and part of a systematic campaign, they say, to strip the Muslims of their identity and culture. The US House of Representatives agrees. It overwhelmingly passed a bill demanding the camps are closed and Communist Party administrators sanctioned for human rights abuses. China is condemning the proposed law and is threatening retaliation. Adrian Brown has more from Hong Kong.
At first, China's government denied their existence. But then last year, state television released pictures of what were described as vocational training centres, where ethnic Muslim Uyghurs are learning new skills in the remote western region of Xinjiang. Human rights groups estimate that more than 1 million Uyghurs are being held in what they describe as a 21st century gulag, where inmates are being brainwashed and forced to renounce their religion. Now the United States House of Representatives has decided it's time to act. It voted overwhelmingly to call on President Donald Trump to apply sanctions against senior Chinese officials. The bill, which refers to arbitrary detention, torture and harassment, still needs to be approved by the Senate and the President before it becomes law. On Wednesday, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson read a lengthy prepared statement accusing Washington of a random smear, urging it to correct its mistake.
The relevant bill deliberately slanders the human rights situation in China and Xinjiang and blackens China's efforts to eliminate extremism and crack down on terrorism. It will definitely have an effect on China-US cooperation in important areas.
It is just a week since Trump signed another contentious bill into law that is also raising tensions between Washington and Beijing on another front, Hong Kong, where anti-government protests are almost into their 6th month. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act has been welcomed by protesters there because it means the city's special trading status with the US will now be dependent on a yearly review. The law can also be used to punish officials deemed to be suppressing freedoms. In retaliation, China has halted American warship visits to Hong Kong and sanctioned several non-governmental organizations.
It is unclear what all this means for the other big point of friction between China and the United States right now, their trade war. Analysts warn that the odds on there being an agreement before Christmas have now been lowered after President Trump warned there was now no deadline for a deal.
And on Wednesday, China also said it doesn't have a deadline for a deal now either. Adrian Brown for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest, Max Oitman, professor at Georgetown University, specializing in modern Chinese history. He joins me here in the studio. Olsi Yagezi is a lecturer at the University of Durrës in Albania. He visited Uyghur camps in Xinjiang in August and joins us by Skype from Albania's capital, Tirana. Andy Mock is senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. He joins us from Beijing. Welcome to all our guests. Max, the wording of the proposed bill is very strong and it requires President to impose sanctions on members of the China's political bureau. Is this a new escalation in the already strained relations between China and the United States of America?
Yes, I agree. This is a serious escalation, I think, of the kind of intentions between the United States and China.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Chinese reaction will be stronger? Are they going to reciprocate, or do you think they will just be confined to cosmetic or symbolic gestures like visa restrictions, visa bans?
Speaking as a historian, I have to say I think that we're in uncharted territory right now. I'm frankly not sure how the Chinese government will respond to this escalation by the United States. It's possible, as they've indicated so far, that they may take measures against U.S. diplomats and other U.S.-affiliated non-governmental organizations that are trying to operate within China. It's also quite possible that they may take action against American academics and American universities that have programs within China. That's a big personal concern of myself.
Also, you've recently been to the camps invited by the Chinese government. China says that those camps are purely for voluntary re-education. Give us your impressions about what you saw there.
Well, my idea before visiting these camps was the same. I never imagined that China would do what it is doing at present. After my visit, I visited Xinjiang between 16 to 25 of August. And during our visit, we visited cities, we attended lectures from communist officials, and among others, we visited even these camps. And during our visit, we found out that these are not vocational training centers, as the Chinese claim, but they're prisons. These are mass detention centers where Muslim Uyghurs, they are taken from their homes, and the only crime that they have committed so far, and what I found out from the interviews that I made with these people that the Chinese government presented to us, their only crime was believing in God, believing in Islam, and reading articles or watching videos that are related to their culture or religion. So in my opinion, these are not vocational training centers like the Chinese claim. And for the people who have seen my videos on YouTube, the Chinese teachers who were in these centers, they failed to prove to me that these are schools. In these so-called vocational training centers, people are forcefully taken and sent in.
Okay. Andy, as the pressure is piling up against China, what do you think would be Beijing's next move? A tit for tat, for example?
Well, I think Beijing has been the Chinese government has been very consistent, very clear, and I think very predictable in its response. You know, the bedrock principle for the Chinese government is respect for sovereignty. And, you know, I think the message has been pretty clear that this is viewed as a very serious interference in China's sovereignty. So given that, however, I think the response remains to be seen. I agree with the other guests that we are in uncharted territory here, and perhaps we can even call it chaotic approach that makes it very, very difficult to respond, whether we're talking about trade, whether we're talking about domestic issues, other issues as well, either bilateral or multilateral.
Max, this has different layers. We're talking about the human rights angle, and this is what has prompted that strong reaction from the United States of America. But it also has an economic angle, which is the interim trade agreement, which was supposed to be signed anytime now. Do you think that this undermines the chances for that trade deal to be signed?
I think that the implications of your question are probably correct. That it's really hard to imagine U.S. and Chinese negotiators reaching a deal anytime soon on major trade-related issues. Although, to be perfectly frank, before Congress began moving on this bill, it was also hard to imagine real progress on trade negotiations. And in some respects, I'm quite sympathetic with some comments made by the guest in Beijing. The United States has not had a very coherent set of policies and approaches to either trade or human rights in China. So if I was to put myself in the position of a Chinese government official, I'm really not sure how I would respond to the U.S. actions because they're very unpredictable, and it's very difficult to know what the Americans will do next.
Mm-hmm. Olsi, you've been to the camps and you've posted your videos, you've written about your experience over there. How do you explain that the Muslim world has been so far silent about what's happening to the Uyghurs?
The problem in the Muslim world is that it suffers from dictatorships, and in many Muslim countries or Arab countries, let us say, we do not have the freedom of speech and we do not have the democratic debate that we have in the West. Nevertheless, we have a number of Muslim countries who have reacted against it. We have Turkey, for example, and we have other great Muslim democracies from, let us say, Indonesia to Malaysia, where civil society organizations are reacting against it. But then when it comes, we have many Muslim countries which are not democratic. And then when it comes to their relation with China, they do not want to upset China. Because unlike the United States, which goes to many of these Muslim countries with demands about democracy, human rights, and what have you, the Chinese, they have no such ethics. Mm-hmm. Chinese are good and great friends of dictators, and many, especially Arab dictators, they love China because China supplies them with money, with weapons, with mass surveillance equipments, and let us say to expect some Arab dictatorships where they oppress their own people and send their own ulamas and their own Muslim leaders in prisons, and to expect these people to tell to China why you are doing exactly the same thing that we do. I don't think that we should expect something like this.
Mm-hmm. Andy, I mean, the Chinese narrative has been constantly challenged by international observers, human rights activists. The data that was leaked over the past few weeks that shows that people there are locked down, they are persecuted, they are punished just because of their Muslim beliefs. What is next for China then?
Well, I think it's important to clarify here what's going on. So I would say that if you go to any population of detained people for whatever reasons, they would say they've done nothing wrong. And I'll use the U.S. as an example. We look at the United States with one of the largest absolute number of people incarcerated and one of the highest per capita as well. We could argue that a lot of these that are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes like drug possession, some as trivial as marijuana possession, and say this is a violation of human rights. But on the other hand, if we accept this idea of nation states, that they have the sovereignty to make their own laws and enforce their own laws, yes, any country we can point out and say, well, what they're doing is wrong, we don't like it. But I think if we accept this idea of sovereignty, I think this is the main issue at work here.
Yeah, although sovereignty should not... Honestly, I think you feel like you want to say something?
Yes, I just want to respond to Andy. I mean, while he is right and when he talks about the sovereignty of China, but I think his comparison between what the United States does on mass incarcerating its own people, and he mentioned the possession of drugs, etc. I think there can be no comparison between what China is doing and what the United States is doing. The people that I interviewed in the Wenxi County Vocational Training Center, which is in Aksu, these people, they were not criminals. These people, they were sent to these concentration camps only for reading the Quran. So, I mean, yes, we can be as much as we want critical of the United States and what it does in the world, but what China is doing is unimaginable. People are being locked down in these concentration camps only for praying to their God, only for asking their mothers to pray to God, only for going on the internet and watching Muslim tele-evangelical videos. So in few words, what the Chinese authorities are doing in Xinjiang is that they have declared Islam an illegal religion. The Chinese authorities, after the Urumqi riots of 2019, they are treating Xinjiang as a military occupied province. For people who visit Xinjiang, they will think that they are in Afghanistan when the Americans invaded it. You see military and police presence, and if you read the de-extremification regulations of Xinjiang authorities, you will see that the authorities have declared any sign of Islam to be extremism. And according to these standards, if, God forbid, China were to rule the Middle East, all the Muslims of the Middle East would end up in concentration camps.
Max, please go ahead.
When it comes to the question of Chinese sovereignty and the argument that's been put forward that China has the right and responsibility to practice and implement whatever laws it sees fit, that may be true, but what's happening in Xinjiang is entirely extrajudicial. This is happening outside of China's usual criminal justice framework. It's also important to point out it's even happening outside of China's traditional laogai or thought reform infrastructure. This is an entirely new system, infrastructure set of policies which have been developed since 2009. They were implemented only in 2016 and 2017, but this is a new system that's been developed in order to tackle the deeper underlying issue, which is ethnic separatism. So to some extent, the question of Islam and China's current assaults on public piety or public representations of Islam or visiting mosques is only a superficial aspect of what's happening here. In 2009 and 2008, the Chinese government and Chinese policymakers, Chinese academics, suddenly realized in the aftermath of enormous street violence that the whole story they'd been telling themselves about the Chinese people as a multi-ethnic state, a multi-ethnic people that was harmonious, all part of sort of big and little brothers, part of one family, they realized this rhetoric had failed. And Chinese policymakers were shocked in 2009 to see that there were enormous parts of people living in the borderlands who did not feel Chinese, right? And so in the last couple of years, what the Chinese government is really trying to do is to transform the way that people in the borderlands think. They really want them to think and to identify right off the bat as Chinese. They don't want there to be any possibility that people living in these regions can identify with other places or with alternate forms of identity. Look, if the people in Xinjiang happen to be Catholic, I do think that the Chinese government would be implementing similar types of policies to eradicate Catholicism in Xinjiang. Now, since the war on terror began in 2001, it's been very useful for the Chinese government to adopt Islamophobic rhetoric. This plays well in an international marketplace. It plays well in China's domestic marketplace. But for decades, if not centuries before, the Chinese government has been very reluctant to engage in Islamophobic types of policies and has had very constructive or relatively constructive policies towards religion, which have tolerated, have given a certain amount of space, even for public religiosity. But the reason they're tackling religion now is not because they have an a priori fear of Islam. It's because they have a much deeper fear of ethnic separatism, both in Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, other places.
Andy, clearly China is failing to win the hearts and minds of people in the Uighurs and failing at the same time to sell its narrative to the international community. Do you think that the Chinese are willing to make any concessions?
Well, I'm not sure I would say failing. So, as our guest just said, I think he made very valid points, but perhaps is overstating it a bit in that, yes, ethnic separatism clearly is a concern for China. So I think our guest was absolutely correct in saying that there was perhaps a shock, at least a recognition that something needed to be changed regarding the risk of separatism. And in addition, I don't think the the description of this as a fight against religious extremism
but
and
then,
terrorism
Andy, I'm sorry if I'm
purely
to
for external consumption.
jump in here.
Please,
Does
go
it
ahead.
justify this fear of ethnic separatism? Does it justify putting over 1 million people in a modern time gulag?
Well, I would again maybe question your description of that as a modern day gulag. If we look at the creation of new institutions, look at the United States with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, some of the measures that it took, some of them quite violent against other countries as a reaction to terrorist attacks. So if we look at it in that context, I don't think it's extreme that what China has done. Had there been casualties, perhaps abuses, I would almost imagine there must have been, because any large-scale bureaucratic undertaking, I mean, you could have a football contest with 30,000 people, and the likelihood is someone would die, someone would get hurt, and that's just the law of large numbers. So I would question that, is this a quote-unquote gulag? I think it is also meant to address the issue of ethnic separatism and create a Chinese identity. Yes, so that's
I
how
see. I see your
respond
point,
to that.
Max.
I think it's important for me to add at this point, too, that I also personally traveled to Xinjiang in 2018. I was there during Ramadan, and I personally witnessed the fact that you could not enter a mosque anymore, that people were not able to observe the fast, that all religious establishments, including Christian churches and Buddhist establishments, had been closed during this period. And I spoke with people who were building the camps, and I spoke with security personnel at multiple levels within the Xinjiang Uighur Autonomous Region. And the language that they used was that of political re-education. This was not about vocational training. It was just simply not about vocational training. It was about trying to eradicate people's senses of difference from the Chinese majority population. And villages I visited, neighborhoods of Urumqi, the capital, were empty of Uyghurs. And they had not gone on vacation.
Olsi, you've been very critical of the back of your trip there of the Chinese government, but other people would tell you that rehabilitation centers have existed in different parts of the world, including the Muslim world, where authorities had to tackle the need to combat extremism.
Exactly. And when I went to Xinjiang, I was expecting the Chinese authorities to use these so-called vocational training centers to, de-radicalize terrorists and suicide bombers and people with extremist ideas. But as a matter of fact, it was not true. As Max rightly mentioned, what the Chinese are doing now, they have declared a war on multiculturalism. They do not want to tolerate diversity anymore in China. And I think that the problem in China is not only the so-called concentration camps or the mass detention centers, but are even other policies that the Chinese government is doing towards Xinjiang. Number one, we have mass colonization with Han Chinese who are brought from other parts of China in order to destroy the ethnic balance of the region. And number two, as some Chinese officials told me when I was in Xinjiang, who were very critical of their government, but they could not speak up because, of course, they were afraid. And they told me they bring us from other parts of China here, but they force us every year to spend 1 month with Uyghurs and sleep in their homes.
Thank you.
So what the Chinese are doing, they have penetrated even the homes of the Uyghurs, where you no longer can have a privacy, even though if you are not a religious at all, even if you accept to drink alcohol and to eat pork and to renounce your religion, you still are not safe in Xinjiang if you are not a Han Chinese.
Thank you,
because the government is going to bring somebody to live with you and your wife.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Max, Oitman, Olsi, Yajizi, Andy Mok, I really appreciate your presence today. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahalbara, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.